Good evening, gentlemen. It has been quite a while since we've had a class, since we've had a chance to all gather here. It's been a while since we've had a class and had a chance to gather, all of us here together. And therefore, since it's been a while and since it's very easy to forget, especially when you have big breaks, sort of the flow of what we're doing and the sort of where we're holding, tonight's class will, God willing, be a Tanya review. We are going to review the 4.5 chapters, more or less, we have learned so far of the Tanya. This Tanya class, we began learning Tanya last year, Chol HaMoed Sukkos, which means that we didn't have a class Chol HaMoed Sukkos this year, so we missed the 1-year anniversary of this class. We are now into the second year of this class teaching Tanya. We are going at the breakneck pace of around 5 chapters a year. And there's 53 chapters in the first part of Tanya, so you can figure out how long it is going to take us to finish. But not to be discouraged, it's not about how fast you get there, it's about whether you can actually understand anything along the way, right? Which I think we said in our first class was sort of going to be our goal. It's not the most, what you would call in Yiddish, our Thursday night class is not the most lumdish class in the world. It's not here to analyze necessarily every jot and tittle of the Tanya as it has been analyzed through the generations, and to explore textual contradictions or even the most profound philosophy of Tanya. But this class does, the reason why this class goes so slowly is because we are trying to be sensitive to and orient ourselves toward the fundamental, you could say the axiomatic principle, the principle that we accept as a given, that the Alter Rebbe in Tanya is trying to reorient our entire life towards God. And since we are aiming to turn over our entire life and to reorient our entire life, there is a lot going on in the Tanya. The Tanya is very terse. It contains a lot in a very small space. Every line contains a lot of things, even if your goal is to only learn it as our basic goal is, to learn it according to the simple meaning. We are just trying to understand the simple and direct intent of the Tanya. It just turns out that the simple and direct intent of the Tanya is very, very complicated and basically creates an entire worldview, an entire way of looking at life. And so our class is rather slow, judging by the text, but hopefully it is also rather interesting and enriching and informative, and actually takes into account we respect the depth of the Tanya. We respect the depth even of the simple meaning of the Tanya, the depth of the goal and the purpose of the Alter Rebbe. So this is a Tanya class that is aware of everything that we explained in the Alter Rebbe's introduction, which we're going to get to in just a moment, which was the first chapter that we learned. And so without further ado, we are going to try and do 4.5 chapters of Tanya in less than an hour, which is, if you were paying attention to this whole speech, much faster than we normally go. Way faster. So it should be interesting what we can pack in, but the good news is that this is all reviews. In other words, if something seems unclear, we won't have time to explain most of what we touch on today. This is a memory jogging exercise, and if there's anything that you want more clarity on, the good news is that all the classes are on YouTube and the Shul's Facebook page, and you can go and review all of these classes as you wish in your own time. So from next week, God willing, we're going to come back and resume learning in the middle of chapter 4. And my goal is actually to try and speed up a little, if at all possible, and to try and get through chapter 4 and well onto chapter 5, because this year, judging by the speed we learn, we're going to spend a lot of time learning about the Nefesh HaBahamis, and that will come, the animal soul, and that will come all as a chunk in chapters 6, 7, and 8, and we want to get to that sort of multi-chapter topic that will hopefully string together and cover most of the classes that we aim to do before next Chol Hamoed Sukkos. The Alter Rebbe writes the Tanya as an answer to a question. That's how we began this whole discussion. That's what we spoke about on Chol Hamoed Sukkos of last year. The Tanya is an answer to a question. It's very important to understand this and to always have it in mind, because a lot of the frustration with learning Tanya comes about from the fact that the Alter Rebbe does not justify himself in Tanya at all. Tanya is not a polemical work. It is not a work that is looking to convince you of something. Tanya is entirely take it or leave it, and the Alter Rebbe is very happy for you if you choose to leave it, so to speak. In other words, there is nothing stopping you from leaving. You can leave at any time. You can choose for some reason to not accept something the Alter Rebbe says at any time, and most of us do. The Tanya is here to answer a question. If you're not interested in having your question answered, then the Tanya, that specific question answered, then the Tanya will not help you. The Tanya is not here to convince you that God exists, that Torah is true, or any other, an innumerable list of other principles. The Alter Rebbe is speaking to someone that knows that God exists, and someone that knows the Torah is true, but who doesn't see where God is in his Torah and mitzvahs. In other words, you can be a fully observant Jew. You can be a Jew that keeps all of the mitzvahs and keeps all of the Torah, even the mitzvahs which are about God, by the way, which it's nowadays is becoming vitally important to point out. There's no room really in a review class for me to give a whole rant about this, but long story short, many of the mitzvahs directly concern God, such as love of God and fear of God, etc., unifying God's name. A person can even keep those mitzvahs according to the letter of the law and yet still feel that God is missing. The question that the Tanya comes to answer, as explained on its title page, is to explain how it's very close to you that you can serve God in your mouth and in your heart to do it, which means, in plain English, it's very close to a Jew to be able to have authentic love and fear of God, which is surprisingly difficult to do, by the way, even with the Alter Rebbe's advice, and certainly without it, because as the Alter Rebbe as we are actually in the process of learning, although it's a very long process and it's not clear how this is what we're learning, we're in the process of finding out that a lot of what we think may be God and godly and the love and fear of God really has nothing to do with God whatsoever. And that's why you don't feel a consistent connection with God or anything like that. And a lot of what we consider to be these things is really just a form of self-deception in animal soul, and really has nothing to do with a true relationship with God. And on the other side, we have the other problem that, never mind faking a fake love and fear, sometimes I feel nothing at all. I do lots of mitzvahs and I keep Torah, and there is no connection whatsoever. It doesn't seem to be a God-centric thing at all. It seems that I am merely conforming to some sort of external system of rules and behaviors, which really, even when they're talking about God, really his presence does not seem to be there. So the Tanya is about someone that is seeking God. That's the question. The question is, where is God? And again, if you don't have the question, you're always free to close the book. There is nothing in the Tanya where the Alter Rebbe says, this is why you should be seeking God. However, as we did explain at the very end of the, last year, and we were doing these first few classes, we did explain that, however, there is a concept that learning the Tanya is a segula, it is a way, it is a spiritual means, a spiritual trick to having the correct question. In other words, even though the Alter Rebbe will tell you that if you don't have the question, then you're out of luck, right? The truth is that the study of the Tanya, even though it never says why you should have the question, the Tanya does make the question stronger. It does help a person. It helps the soul be healthier, and the healthier soul, the healthier godly soul, the strengthened godly soul is able to feel more that desire more profoundly. We learned the Hakdamas Hamalaket, the introduction to Tanya, the compiler's foreword, which, as we explained, is the Alter Rebbe's extremely humble way of referring to himself. And although the book does come Mipi Sfarim and Mipi Seifrim, as it says in the title page, it does come from teachings of various teachers and various Torah works. The fact is that the Tanya is 100% original. The Alter Rebbe has created a worldview within Judaism and a whole system, so to speak, a systematic approach to Judaism and specifically to Chassidus and Chassidic teaching that before the Alter Rebbe basically does not exist at all. The Alter Rebbe is a true original, so naturally he calls himself merely the compiler. The entire introduction to the Tanya is a chapter about why the book should not have been written, as you may recall. Alter Rebbe speaks at great length about why books are no good. Books are no bueno. A person needs a teacher. You need a master. You should be coming to a Rebbe, not to a book. What are you doing here learning a book? Because a book is open to misinterpretation, and the author of the book doesn't know you, and they may not be speaking to your specific issues and the specific issues of your soul, or they may be speaking to your issues, but they're not speaking to you in a way that you can appreciate what they're speaking. Books are incredibly limited, which is why the oral law was always oral, one of the reasons why, and taught teacher to student, because then the teacher can make sure that the teaching is well fitted to the receiver. And then the Alter Rebbe proceeds to say, however, I'm writing this book anyway, and this book will function as a meeting with me. And this is why we said in those classes that the Tanya is not really a book. In the Alter Rebbe's definition of a book, it is meant to not have the limitations of a book somehow, right? Which is a very mystical thing and is connected to the first principle that we said, that the Tanya is an answer to a question. In other words, what the Alter Rebbe is saying is, every Jewish soul that has the question, where is God? I am putting myself in this book, and this book will present to him the answers to that question, will help him answer that question, will help him find and discover godliness. The Tanya is not meant to be a written work. The Tanya is meant to be an encounter with the Alter Rebbe that somehow happens through text rather than personally. And of course, we spoke about how the Chassidim have a tradition that the Alter Rebbe was aware of and wrote the Tanya for the personal circumstances of everyone that would ever learn the Tanya. In other words, the Tanya is speaking to the soul of every single individual who would pick up and study the Tanya. It is not a single book. It is your encounter with the Alter Rebbe, with the Rebbe who is helping you discover godliness. Which is also important to keep in mind when you learn Tanya, because if you learn Tanya only as a book, you may give up far too early, which is what most of us do, at trying to figure out how it actually speaks to your problem. Or you may accept an extremely non-rigorous and ill-fitted way of fitting it to your problem. Whereas the faith and the knowledge that the Alter Rebbe was trying to speak to you through this book will help you try and find the actual teachings, the actual level at which it speaks to you. The Alter Rebbe does note that if you have trouble finding your answers in the Tanya, you have to go to your local Chassidus teacher, and they are commanded not to have false humility and withhold from you any explanations of what's in the Tanya, as they have to teach you. Which is if all of that was the explanation for the book, then that part's the explanation for the class, I suppose. Okay. Chapter 1 of the Tanya begins. It's the Sefer Shel Beinanim, the book of the intermediate man, which you may not remember because we spoke a lot about the intermediate man on the first half of the first page of chapter 1, and then promptly, completely forgot about him, and we'll only get back to him much, much later. Chapter 1 begins with a series of questions. The first 12 chapters of Tanya, roughly, are meant to be the answers to those questions, but we never go back and refer to those questions throughout those 12 chapters. In other words, the Alter Rebbe asked, which is very typical of all Hasidic discourses from all of the Chabad Rebbeim. The questions are at the beginning and the answers eventually come, but in between there can often be a very lengthy and often seemingly unrelated exploration that is not connected to the questions. So the questions are questions like, the soul is sworn to be righteous, but to view itself as non-righteous, as the Talmud says. But elsewhere, the Mishnah says to not view yourself as non-righteous, to not view yourself as wicked. And furthermore, if a person views themselves as wicked, they can come to be very sad and they won't be joyous in serving Hashem. But if they don't view themselves as wicked, then they can come to have a lot of folly and to treat the service of God lightly and to not take it seriously. So how do we explain this textual and logical contradiction? Furthermore, what is a tzaddik, a rasha, and a beinoni? The three categories of the righteous, the wicked, and the intermediate man, as defined in the Talmud, also seems riddled with contradictions. You have Rabbah, who is obviously a tzaddik gamor, who is an utterly righteous man, calling himself and mistaking himself for a beinoni, for an intermediate man. How is that possible if an intermediate man means a person with half transgressions and half mitzvahs, half merits and half demerits? And did God create the tzaddik, rasha, and beinoni? Is this an inherent state or not? Is this something that God creates the wicked, or do people choose to be wicked? The Talmud seems to prevaricate on that as well. So these are the questions at the beginning of chapter 1 of Tanya, and then we don't answer them. We say, in order to answer all of these questions, we have to rebuild your worldview from the ground up, which is really what the Alter Rebbe is doing in the first 12 chapters of Tanya. The Alter Rebbe in these chapters is to be able to even speak about what a Jew has to do and how a Jew has to find God. We can't do that unless we have shared definitions. What is a Jew? What is God? What does it mean to want to find God? What's the problem to be able to find the solution? In order to answer this, the Alter Rebbe basically has to very, very tersely re-explain all of reality to you, how he sees it. This week we're learning Parshas Bereshis. Shabbos Bereshis is tomorrow night. Genesis, the chapter of the first chapters of the book of Genesis, Parshas Bereshis. The Torah, the revealed Torah, the Chumash, begins with the creation of the world. The Alter Rebbe in Tanya begins with the soul, which is interesting because in a way it's almost opposite. The revealed Torah, which speaks to revealed, so to speak, external or objective realities, begins with the story of objectivity. It begins with, here's a thing that exists, whatever that means. And the Torah doesn't stop to tell us what existence is. It assumes we know, because you're an objective reality, I'm an objective reality. Let's talk about where did objective reality come from. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Tanya has a totally different approach, radically backwards, the opposite, in fact, right? The Tanya says the first thing you have to understand is a soul. The first thing you have to understand is a concept called a soul. A soul is a person, right? Not an objective reality. It is a subjective, spiritual reality, a self, right? We begin with the discussion of the self. And as it's going to turn out, as we've already discussed in the context of, we've gotten to it already in chapter 4, that external world discussed in Genesis is really just a meeting of selves. That's all it is. In other words, rather than beginning with existence, we treat existence in Tanya as a secondary or even tertiary or even lower reality. That something exists objectively, that this table is here, right? That is already like... that's already a very unimportant thing, so to speak, right? That's already later in chapter 4. If you read chapter 4 between the lines, you'll see that there could be something like a table that exists maybe, right? Out in the external world. What really exists is a soul, is you yourself, right? The inwenigsten ich, the innermost self of a person, right? Never mind the fact that there's two. We'll get to that in a second. But the fact is we begin with the self, and this is in accordance with the theme that I've been trying to repeat in every chapter we've learned so far of the Tanya, that the Alter Rebbe's reorientation is fundamentally from chitzonius to pnimius, from the external or outer reality to the inner reality. The Alter Rebbe says that the way you find God is not going to be from the outside. The way you're going to find God is going to be from the inside, and you have to understand what I mean by the inside, and that is the foundation of all things. Yes? So, Chapter 1 is about the animal soul, the first of the two souls of the Jew that is mentioned in Tanya. It is also the first of the two souls that a person possesses, right? The child is born with the animal soul fully present, and the godly soul only slowly enters the person until the age of bar mitzvah, we say. First beginning at the bris, really, and then continuing until the age of bar mitzvah. The animal soul is the soul of our regular experience, which is something that's said more explicitly later in Tanya, but I'll tell you now. The animal soul is our typical experience, as I keep reminding you, because people get very gung-ho and try and think that anything possibly related to the Torah must be coming from the godly soul, right? The godly soul is a self whose only interest is in God. It doesn't relate to, or not just to have any interest in, it doesn't even relate to anything other than God and godliness, right? So in other words, if you have a self or a self-conception as a independent being who is interested in anything that may come, right, that is a sign we are talking about the animal soul. The godly soul is something else entirely, and much more, in terms of experience, much more difficult to relate to, which is why we've been spending so much time in chapters 2, 3, and 4, and we're going to spend more time in chapter 5 to understand the godly soul. But the Tanya doesn't start with the godly soul. The Tanya begins with the animal soul, the regular soul of our experience. The regular soul of our experience comes from something called klipas nega, which means the translucent shell, which we really don't have a lot of time to explain tonight. However, the bottom line is, the conclusion of the whole explanation of the different levels of klippas and the different levels of shells, and what do we mean by a shell reality, is like this. The bottom line is as follows. In Chassidus, God precedes existence. Existence is something that comes from God. God is not something that exists. In other words, you can't think of God as there's me, and I exist in a big fish tank of existence, as we called it when we learned this chapter, for better or for worse. And then somewhere else in the big fish tank, there's a huge fish that's much bigger than me, right? And that's called God. And I'm going to encounter him out among the things that exist. This table exists, this mug exists, I exist, and out there somewhere God exists. Tanya says, no. That's not how it works at all, right? It's not how it works at all. God precedes existence. There's no such thing as neutral existence. In other words, there's no such thing as something just existing. There's God. God is the only reality, right? God makes that other things have something called existence, that they have something called to be. They come into being. Things that come into being fall into two categories. There's kedusha, which means holiness, and then there's klippa, which means the shell. Holiness is that existence which knows, and when we say know, we mean at an existential level, right? Not know intellectually. It reflects in its very being that it is only a manifestation of the divine. It knows that what it is, that its existence is divine, is godly. Klippa is an existence that thinks that existence is separate from God, that there's something called something that just exists, is fundamentally what klippa is, the shell reality. So the way we were putting it in our summaries when we learned this chapter is that klippa begins from the statement I am. That's the essence of klippa. Klippa, which is a concealment of God, a thing that denies the reality of God just by existing, right? This was very important as well, that we tried to explain over at least a couple of classes, that when we talk about the denial of God in Klippa, we don't mean a denial like evil acts, right? The reality of evil, of the other side of the Klippa in Chassidus, is a denial of God existentially, right? It's a denial of God just by existing. There is such a thing that just by existing it denies God. Want an example of one? This table, right? Because God is the only reality, this table seems to say, I'm real, right? This itself is a denial of God. This itself is a denial of the true reality of God, which is that only God exists. Right? Now, it's a God-created denial. It's nobody's fault, right? So to speak. It's God's fault. God made something that denies his reality. But what we have to keep in mind is that the very existence of the thing is what does the denying. Klippas nega, which is the translucent klippa, meaning it lets light through it, right, is the closest thing that we would say to neutral existence, right? It's I am. I am could be I am good, I am evil, I am for God, I am against God, but all of them are I am. And when you're saying I am, God is not saying only I am, which is the truth. Which is why even Klippas Nega, even the very something merely existing, so to speak, is a denial of the truth of God. Something else saying I am is not God saying only I am. Right? Or God saying, I am. Yes? Below Klippas Nega, below it, at a lower level, much worse than the translucent klippa, are what's called the three impure klippas, the three impure shells or peels, right? They begin to say things like, only I. Not I am, but only I, right? In other words, they don't leave room for other things to be. When I say I am, it could be that God am as well. Right? It could be that God also exists. He's just not where I am. I am, and God is. The three impure klippas are the denial of God. They say, only I. Only I. There is no God. Right? I am the center of reality. And that's when you get to the lower and the more impure things. So backing up again, we tried to do that as quickly as possible, this explanation of the shell realities. Everything exists fundamentally in truth only as an extension of God. Right? That's why it's called a peel, right? It's like a banana peel, right? Everything exists only as an extension of God. You have the banana, it's true, has a fruit aspect and a peel aspect, but as you take the banana off the tree, right, it's all one thing. It's all the banana, right? The problem is, or not the problem, the way God creates superficial realities, klippa realities, God concealing realities, is by removing the fruit from the inside. If you eat the banana, that's actually what brings the banana peel into existence, right? By concealing the fact that the peel exists as only part of a broader manifestation of God, a broader divine reality, you actually, that concealment is what of the fact that it's just the peel of the bigger thing is what brings the peel into existence. You may remember this metaphor as well. The animal soul of a Jew comes from Klippas Nega, which means that we have an existence. When I'm talking to you, the person that I am talking to, right, is fundamentally their very spiritual essence, in their very self. If you strip away everything external and get down to the core of who they really are, what they are is I am. I exist. And everything else about them, as we're going to see more in chapters 6, 7, and 8, is about manifesting and continuing and expressing the fact that they exist. This is called the animal soul. We also, another way it's sometimes called is the biological soul, which makes a lot of sense, because nowadays when we talk about biology, we're very aware, thanks to Dr. Darwin, of the survival instinct, right, and the desire to perpetuate oneself, right, which is, Tanya would agree with Dr. Darwin, he's lucky in this case, that Tanya would agree that the core of biological existence is the perpetuation of self. That is what the animal soul is here to do. The perpetuation and extension of self. And this soul, this animal soul of the Jew, this I am, is the source of the Jew's natural emotional qualities, both good and bad, right? Which already introduces to you some of the depth and complexity of what we mean by I am, because I am is not it's not a morally valent statement. It's not good or evil. It just is. And it may be that just is denies God, right? But just is could be used in many different ways. When the Jew is, I am angry, right? We say that comes from that's a negative emotional quality. But when it's, I am merciful, which is another inherent quality of the Jewish soul, right? That's a, so to speak, a positive quality of the Jewish animal soul. And chapter 1 concludes with the Alter Rebbe's explanation of some very difficult and challenging statements about non-Jews which we find in the Tanya, or which we find in the Talmud, for example, where the Talmud says that the kindness of the non-Jews is sin and that they have no good within them at all. And we explained that in fact, according to the Alter Rebbe's explanation, this is not so difficult to understand and not so difficult to explain, because we are referring to idolaters who are at the level of the klippas, the shalish klippas atameus, the three impure klippas. When the soul comes from a place of only I, there is no room for true goodness, which is godliness. However, the vast majority of Gentiles nowadays, as we explained in chapter 1, are in the level or in the category of Chassidei Umas Ha'elam, the righteous among the nations, who keep the 7 Noahide laws, and we recontextualize those 7 Noahide laws as the means by which the soul, the animal soul, is able to relate to the nefesh hasichlis, which is the intellectual aspect of the animal soul, which is the source of the righteousness of the righteous among the nations. It allows people to grow from only I to I am. And the descent back into idolatry, which, as we discussed in an earlier class, nowadays a better example than bowing down to statues may be certain political ideologies or other things like that, right? Like Hamas is a good example, for example, of something like that nowadays, where they descend from I am into only I, which is how you get the various statements in the Talmud about how even their kindness is wicked, and a person has to worry that a non-Jew will literally, if you go walking with them, they will literally push you off the mountainside. But if you think about that in the context of Hamas, it's not so difficult to understand. Yeah, or a Nazi, etc. So, the Jew as an animal soul. Tanya then takes a sharp turn, and we begin to talk about the godly soul, and we don't get back to the animal soul, and we haven't yet got back to the animal soul in what we're studying. So Tanya immediately begins to discuss and explain the godly soul in chapter 2. The godly soul is much harder to understand in our experience, again, than the animal soul. The godly soul is a piece of God above, literally, which is the second soul of the Jew, which we use various metaphors to explain. We say it's like God blows the soul into Adam's nostrils. You blow from the deepest part of your being. We gave a metaphor of a thought from the mind, right? A thought from God's mind. And we also had the metaphor of the sun, right? Of so to speak, the Son of God, that the Son receives his very being and his very essence from his Father. And we struggled and worked on trying to understand what it means to be a piece of God, right? Which the very term piece of God, achelek elokah, implies two opposites simultaneously. That on the one hand, you essentially are of God, that the soul is of God, but on the other hand, has become separated from God. And elokus shenai nivra, as we say, godliness that has become a creation. The godly soul is absolutely critical to understanding the Alter Rebbe's entire view of what it means to be Jewish and to have a connection with God as a Jew, because the entire notion of connecting to God from the outside is impossible. The entire notion that you will be able to cross the gap as an I am facing the divine I am and trying to connect with God as a finite being is not really something that rationally is possible. However, we have the advantage of a godly soul, which basically functions like a back door, right? The godly soul means that if you dig deep within yourself as a Jew, the Jew has received as an inheritance an inherent connection to God, which means that we don't have to go outward through the world, through intermediaries, to try and attach ourselves to God. On the contrary, we are inherently attached to God from the inside. The soul derives from God's chachma. The godly soul derives from God's chachma, from the wisdom of God. And we explained at length in chapter 2, in the footnote and continuing in the text, that the wisdom of God is one of the 10 spheros, and the wisdom of God is absolutely one with God, is absolutely one with Him as a manifestation of the divine traits. And we explained also at length in chapter 2, or rather not at length according to the content, but at length relatively speaking. We explained that that there's a disagreement between the Kabbalists and the philosophers regarding the nature of God. There's machlekas, and the Alter Rebbe's way of solving that machlekas of the divine traits being a manifestation and a part of God. Chapter 2 goes on to really explain the role of a Rebbe, right, who does not function as a teacher of information, really. That's not the primary function of a Rebbe. We explained with the metaphor of the toenail of the sun is connected to the sun's brain, which is the part of the sun that knows the brain of the father, so to speak, which is a very involved metaphor. We can't get into all of the details here right now, but what it comes out is that the role of a Rebbe, the tzaddik, the leader of the generation, right, which is the neshama klalis, as we call it, the general soul from which the particular souls derive, the role of a Rebbe and a tzaddik is to connect your soul to God, is to connect and to remind the godly soul basically of what it is, to remind the godly soul of its connection to Hashem, and all vitality that the godly soul receives comes through the leaders of the generation, through the Nasi, through the Rebbe, the Tzaddik, and this is the source of the soul's vitality. We should also note that in chapter 2, we did spend a whole class, which you can go and find on YouTube and maybe worth rewatching. We did spend a whole class trying to explain why God made a godly soul in the first place, which was an interesting class, with a very, very profound sikha of the Rebbe, trying to explain the role of the godly soul. Why does God, so to speak, need a soul? Why, if God just wants things to be godly, why doesn't He just make them godly? Like, what's the function of a godly soul in all this? Why did God make it in such a way that that within the finite and limited creation there is a certain thing called the godly soul, which is an expression of God in the creation. And in fact, as we ended up concluding in chapter 2, the godly soul is God saying, I am, right? The godly soul is God saying, I am. The animal soul says, I am for itself. The godly soul is God saying, I am, right? Now, chapter 2 is very, very, very abstract. It's really about the spiritual root of the godly soul. So a person it would be very fair for a person to ask, but what is the actual, a self? When we think of a self and a soul, a human self has experiences, it has an inner life, an inner world, it does things, it feels things, it knows things, right? So what is the experience, so to speak? What does the godly soul think about? What does it feel? What does it do? And that's what we begin to explain in chapter 3. In chapter 3, we begin to explain that the peace of God above, which really is an infinite and transcendent divine being, right? Not something that exists within the external world with which we are familiar, right? Not something that exists as an objective external reality, interacting with other beings in the world of existences, right? Which we said in general comes from Klipas Noga, which in general is not holy, right? So, it's not even clear what it means for that godly soul to be in the way that this coffee cup is, right? What does it mean that it exists? What does God saying I am actually look like in the world? So chapter 3 begins to explain that. We say that while the infinite definition of the godly soul, so to speak, the deepest definition of the godly soul in its depth is that it is a piece of God, the way that manifests as a finite being is through 10 faculties. The soul has 10 faculties, which correspond to the 10 spheres, the 10 traits of God, from which it derives, as we explained in chapter 2. And those 10 faculties of the soul are how the soul becomes a defined a being that can actually interact with and exist among other defined beings in the world as we're familiar with it. And we explained that in general, the 10 faculties are divided into 2 groups. You have Seichel and Midos, the first 3 of the 10 faculties, and then you have the last 7 of the 10 faculties of the soul. And fundamentally, we explained and we gave a relatively quite lengthy explanation of what all of these 10 faculties are, and how fundamentally the idea is that the godly soul receives the process of the spheres, so to speak. The 10 spheres represent or constitute a process of self-creation, of self-construction, right? It's the construction of the finite self, this finite godly self, the limited and defined godly self, which exists among other selves. And that construction follows the process of the receiving of a fundamental, direct knowledge, which is what comes into Chachma, which is the first of the 10 faculties, right? In the godly soul, all of its Chachma is about God. It's not inherently connected to anything else, unlike perhaps the animal soul, and therefore all of its inherent and immediate intuitions and direct knowledge is all knowledge of God, which ultimately is self-knowledge in the godly soul. Its self-contained direct knowledge of itself is knowledge of God, because it is a piece of God, right? That knowledge comes into Chachma through the intellectual faculties. The godly soul basically turns this direct knowledge into and builds from it a rational idea, so to speak, a finite idea, a finite external way of relating to God. It basically externalizes its direct knowledge into an idea, or if you prefer, it turns its faith into intellect, it turns its emunah into seichel, it transforms its direct knowledge into indirect knowledge. Or a different way you could say it is, the soul says, this is my direct knowledge, but how would I relate to this from the outside? Right? Which is what Chachma, Bina, and Das are there to answer, the intellectual faculties of the soul. How do I relate to God as a being over there, rather than a being that I know directly in here? Right? That knowledge then goes on to give birth to the emotions, which are which all derive from, are all offsprings from chesed and gevura, love and fear. And what we define as love and fear, rather than certain feelings, which is a very superficial definition of love and fear, our working definition in chapter 3 is this: the midos literally means which we normally translate as emotions, literally means the measures of the soul. That intellectual conception of God allows the soul to then lead to the soul constructing its own shape, its own contours for relating to certain things and not relating to others, or for drawing close to certain things and distancing itself from others. This is the love and fear of God that is born in the godly soul. So the godly soul, from its conception of God, whether, as we said in chapter 3, whether it's a higher conception, then it will give birth to more refined emotions. If it's a lower conception or of a lower level in godliness, a lower aspect of God, then it will give birth to more coarse and simpler, lower emotions, right? But whatever emotions it gives birth to, that is the shape or the measure of the godly soul as it exists as a finite being. The godly soul with its emotions is now a thing that has dimensionality, that has a measure that can then relate to God externally. So in other words, the soul says, this thing about God is appealing to me and makes me want to draw close. This thing about God makes me feel very small. It makes me feel like nothing, makes me want to move further away. These are the love and fear of the godly soul. And so with these 10 faculties, the godly soul constructs itself as a finite being that exists among other external beings. Which brings us, of course, to chapter 4, which we are in the middle of studying right now. Chapter 4 says, okay, that's what the godly soul is, but what does that godly soul, which is a finite being of intellect and emotions, what does it do? Does it actually interact with other beings? And the answer is, yes, it does, right? Primarily with God. Right? God is the, as we keep saying, is the natural focus and the only thing the godly soul is really interested in. So the godly soul, what does it do, right, with its interfaces, as we've been translating Levushim, with its garments, right, where a self meets another self, right? How does the godly soul interact with other selves? Through basically Torah and mitzvahs, through studying the Torah and fulfilling the commandments of God. That is what the godly soul does. And we've been explaining that Torah and mitzvahs are, the learning of the Torah and the doing of mitzvahs, are not external impositions on the godly soul. So to speak, the godly soul has no knowledge of these things and it's totally foreign to it. And then God comes and tells it, put on tefillin. On the contrary, the mitzvahs are an utterly authentic and spontaneous manifestation of the godly soul. The godly soul loves God, and because it loves God, it wants to connect Him. And what's the way it wants to connect Him? Through wrapping tefillin. And in fact, the 10 faculties can really be broken down into the 248 limbs of the king, which are the 248 ways that the soul knows and has within it to relate to God. And therefore, the mitzvahs are a manifestation of the soul's love. They are not something that is imposed on the godly soul. They come from inside the godly soul, on the one hand. On the other hand, the mitzvahs have the other advantage of being the express will of God, which is why they are the only way for that love and fear of God we were explaining in chapter 3 to actually culminate and actually find connection with God. Because once that love and fear are created in the godly soul, it has created them again as an external relating or a finite being. And therefore, its love and fear are not actually able to reach God. It has dug itself, painted itself into a corner. By creating a finite and defined love and fear, it has in that very same act precluded itself from ever truly relating to God Himself. Because God Himself is beyond any finite emotion or contour. Right? What shape is it that you draw to hold God or to grasp God? And the answer is, of course, the question is ridiculous. God cannot be possessed in this way. He cannot be grasped in this fashion, to use the physical metaphor of the contours, right? Therefore, the only way that the soul has to actually act on this love, right, to actually have a love that connects it with God in a true and real way. We explained / ranted at length about how in Chassidus the connection with God is an objective reality, right? When we say connect with God, we don't mean a feeling. We mean the same way you can embrace a person physically, the soul literally embraces God. The soul literally connects with the reality of God in a way that is much more objective than we are normally accustomed to speaking about such experiences in our culture. Right? The soul actually connects with God. How? Through the 248 positive commandments. And how does it have fear of God and avoid separation from God? Through keeping the 365 negative commandments, the 365 thou shalt not, which are the culmination of its own inherent love and fear of the Creator. This basically brings us up to, more or less, we tried our best to very quickly go through all of the chapters of Tanya we've learned so far, from the title page through halfway through chapter 4, where we are now. The plan moving forward is to continue our progress through chapter 4, try and pick up the pace a little bit, if at all possible, and continue our discussion of mitzvahs. Chapter 5, of course, is focused on Torah and the incredible value of Torah, where we'll probably have to slow down because it's actually a very, very profound chapter. Although you could say that about any chapter of Tanya. And then in chapter 6, God willing, we'll get back to our old friend, the animal soul, which will be the opportunity for a lot of very interesting discussion, because we're finally getting to things that are much more close to our experience, right? To our actual experience within the world, which again is primarily of the biological and animal soul. And the question of how all of these things come together, a godly soul comes together with an animal soul, etc., is all for later in Tanya. We haven't really got to any of that yet. As far as we know, really the only things that really exist are God and the two souls. We haven't gotten to anything so complicated like that yet. Although, as I did mention earlier, the fact that the soul is a finite being that interacts with other finite beings explains what we mean by the external world. Right? That interact with this table right here, that's all in the levushim, right? Interacting externally among finite beings. So I think it's one lesson we can take away from all these chapters. Obviously, there's many, many lessons, but one of the lessons we can take away from it is that there is a whole other reality than the one in which we walk around and interact finite being to finite being. That's a very, very superficial level of reality. And when you hold on to the Alter Rebbe's talus, when you let the Alter Rebbe pull you along, you'll see, when you study the Tanya, you'll see that that's all very, very secondary. That's all very superficial. Even though it's ironically, as we're struggling with in chapter 4, it's ironically in that objective reality that the greatest connection with God is found, such as through the mitzvahs, right? But nevertheless, you have to know that that's specifically as an external reality that's very far from the true reality of things. On the contrary, that's its whole quality, its whole greatness, is the whole thing that allows you to connect to God there, as explained elsewhere in Tanya, is its very lowliness, is actually its distance from God, is actually what allows you to connect to God there most profoundly. Chassidus is full of these ironies. As you learn more Chassidus, you get more of a taste for this sort of thing. Okay, that's basically the very, very quick review of the first of the 4.5 chapters of Tanya, counting the introduction that we've learned so far. Do we have any questions or things that you want to discuss in the remaining 5 minutes of the class? Okay. Don't all speak up at once. I'll ask you a question. I won't tell you what the answer is. But this week, this week's parsha in Bereshis is the basis for an incredible question. I'm just going to tell you the question. I'm not going to tell you the answer. An incredible question by Rabbi Isaac Homeler in his Sefer Chana Ariel. Rabbi Isaac Homeler, Isaac of Homel, Yitzchak Isaac Halevi of Homel, was one of the great students of the Alter Rebbe. He wrote a lot of his own Chassidus and discourses and information about Chassidus that the Rebbeim themselves would study, which tells you that it's good stuff. There's actually a famous story. The previous Rebbe tells the story. We're really going to use out the last minutes here, so I hope no one has a question. But the previous Rebbe tells the story that his grandfather, the Rebbe Maharash, or Shmuel of Lubavitch, the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe, would learn the Maimarim of Isaac Homeler, right? But his father, the Rebbe Rashab, would only learn the Maimarim of the Rebbes themselves. He wouldn't learn the Chassidus of the Chassidim, so to speak, which obviously is a lower level, right? Is from a whole different place and of a different style, etc. And he asked his father, "How come your father learned this Chassidus, but you didn't. And the Rebbe Rashab said that the Rebbe Maharash heard Chassidus directly from the Rebbe Tzedek, and therefore he had the letters of the Maimar, the letters of the Rav, of the teacher, were always in front of his eyes, and therefore he could never make a mistake following human understanding of Chassidus in the way that we can make a mistake, right? Whatever that means. I don't really know what that whole statement means. It's very interesting, because I don't believe really that the Rebbe Rashab would make a mistake in following human understanding of a Maimer. It's not really something that makes any sense to me, but whatever, that's what the Rebbe Rashab said. So similar to the story of when the Alter Rebbe called himself a Beinoni, which is a mind-blowing story. I probably shouldn't even mention it. Anyway, so what does the previous Rebbe? Here's the point of the story. What does the previous Rebbe conclude this whole story with? He says, from the fact that my father says that I don't want to get confused with human understanding of Chassidus, what do I learn? What did he take away? He took away, there is understanding there. In other words, his father doesn't learn it, but the books are full of understandings. In other words, Isaac Hamler, not so bad, not such you could do worse, right? So he, in his discourse, in his book Chana Ariel, which was just recently republished by Kahas, there's one mimer which is on Tanya. It's on chapter 33, which is one of my favorite chapters of Tanya, and which we'll get into in this class a very long time from now. But in chapter 33, there's a question that Rabbi Isaac asks on the Alter Rebbe based on this week's parsha in Bereshis, right? In chapter 33 of Tanya, it says that God is alone, totally alone, even after the creation. Why? Because all of the creations are batal and totally nullified before him. And the Alter Rebbe in great length goes on to explain how all of the creations are nullified, they don't really exist as independent realities, and therefore God is alone. So Isaac Hamler asks, he says that if you read Parshas Bereshis, and you have the Torah, it talks about someone being alone. Who's alone in Parshas Bereshis? Adam, as our rabbi keeps repeating in his Hakel lecture. It's not good for men to be alone, right? This is a year of Hakel, believe it or not. The Alter Rebbe, so Rabbi Isaac Hamler says that the Torah definition of being alone for Adam, when it says it's not good for Adam to be alone, which is what God says before he creates Eve, before he creates Chava, Adam was not alone. The whole universe had been created. There were animals and the birds and trees and fish, and I suppose chimpanzees, maybe some chimpanzees that looked very much like humans, highly evolved chimpanzees, who knows, right? And yet, Adam was alone, meaning what? Meaning that what it really means to be alone is to be with another like you, is really what it means to be alone, right? He's alone because none of these things are like him or fit for him, right? Even though there's presumably billions, maybe an infinite number of other things, but Adam is still alone, right? So asked Rabbi Isaac Hamler that in fact, by the Torah definition of alone, God is always alone, even if the creation is not nullified. God could create an infinite number of creations. He would still be absolutely alone. No creation can compare at all to the reality of God, who is uncaused and uncreated. So why, in chapter 33 of Tanya, does the Alter Rebbe say that all of the creations have to be nullified? They all have to be batal, right? They have to be nullified for God to be alone. God is inherently alone no matter what. You could be standing right next to God. He would be perfectly alone like he was before he created anything, right? The perfect aloneness of God is not contradicted by the existence of creations. So why does the Alter Rebbe say that the reason God is alone is because the creation is batal? If you want the answer, you can go learn the discourse of Isaac Hamler. Are there any questions on this Tanya review? Next week we're going to move forward in chapter 4. When we get to chapter 33, we can discuss it. When we get to chapter 33, we can discuss it, God willing. All right. Have a good Shabbos, everyone. We'll reconvene next week, God willing.